When an anxious partner finally decides to walk away from an avoidant, something fascinating happens. The dynamic that once seemed stuck suddenly shifts, and both people experience changes they never expected. These quick transformations can be emotional, mental, and even physical, and they reveal just how powerful walking away truly is. When the anxious person finally leaves the avoidant, the first unexpected change that occurs is within the avoidant themselves, and it is often far stronger than they ever imagined. For so long, the avoidant created a sense of safety in knowing that no matter how much they pulled away, no matter how many times they retreated into their shell, the anxious partner would always come back, would always be there to close the distance, to chase, to reassure. That safety net gave them the illusion of control, the belief that they could withdraw without consequence. But when that net disappears, when the anxious finally steps away for good, the avoidant feels an emptiness that rattles them at their core. It is not just about missing a person, it is about missing the certainty of being wanted unconditionally, and that loss lands in a way that they never prepared for. The avoidant often tries to mask emotions, convincing themselves that detachment is strength, that not needing anyone keeps them safe. But the moment the anxious is no longer there, the cracks in that armor begin to show. Suddenly, the silence that once felt comfortable becomes deafening. The space they craved feels too wide, and the freedom they insisted on having tastes bitter instead of sweet. This is where the first wave of realization sets in, that maybe they relied more on the presence of their anxious partner than they admitted, that the push and pull dynamic was not just tolerated but needed because it kept them feeling desired without having to risk real vulnerability. Now, with no messages, no calls, no footsteps chasing after them, the avoidant begins to notice a strange ache, a recognition that the attention they once dismissed was actually the very thing that anchored them. As time passes, the avoidant starts to feel the contrast between what they had and what they are left with. They may go about their day pretending everything is the same, but there are small moments when the absence is undeniable. It could be in the morning when there are no good morning texts waiting, or in the evening when no one checks if they made it home safely. These seemingly small things carry an emotional weight that begins to chip away at the avoidant's belief that they are unaffected. The certainty that the anxious would always return is gone, and in that void grows an uncomfortable awareness that maybe they were taking more than they were giving. That awareness is often what makes this first change so powerful, because it shifts the avoidant from indifference to recognition, from distance to longing, from a stance of control to one of vulnerability they never wanted to feel. The mind of the avoidant then begins to replay moments, sometimes obsessively. They remember the times they pushed away when all their partner wanted was closeness. They recall the arguments where they insisted on needing space when deep down they craved connection. And they revisit the countless reassurances they received but dismissed. Memory becomes a mirror, and instead of seeing the flaws of their partner, they start to see their own patterns reflected back. This reflection is not comfortable, and in many cases, it sparks an internal conflict between the image they have of themselves as independent and the reality of how much they miss the person who once stood by them no matter what. It is in this state that the avoidant often feels a wave of regret they are not used to experiencing, a regret that lingers because it is tied not just to losing someone, but to realizing they had more influence over the relationship's outcome than they wanted to admit. This first change is so striking because it dismantles the avoidant's illusion of control. For the first time, they are confronted with a truth they worked hard to avoid, that even they are not immune to loss, that their defenses cannot protect them from the ache of absence, and that the very thing they thought they wanted, freedom without pursuit, does not satisfy them when it is finally theirs. Instead of feeling powerful, they feel exposed. Instead of feeling safe, they feel unsettled. And instead of feeling untouchable, they feel the sting of missing someone who once gave them unconditional love and presence. The avoidant may not express this openly, but inside, it is a storm that reshapes the way they see both themselves and the partner who chose to walk away. When the anxious partner finally decides to walk away, the second unexpected change is not in the avoidant, but within themselves, and it often comes as the greatest surprise of all. For so long, they lived in a constant state of hyper-awareness, always scanning for signs of rejection, always bracing for withdrawal, and always trying to anticipate the next move of the avoidant. Their nervous system was caught in a cycle of tension that rarely allowed them to rest, as though every moment of silence was a threat and every bit of distance meant abandonment. The act of leaving shifts this entire internal landscape because instead of waiting and reacting, they suddenly reclaim the power to choose. That choice interrupts the endless mental loops, and where there was once constant anxiety, a sense of unexpected calm begins to emerge. This calm is not immediate, but it grows as the days pass and the anxious partner realizes they are no longer chasing a moving target. They wake up and notice that their thoughts are not consumed by what the other person is doing, whether they will respond or how they feel, because there is no longer a need to monitor someone who is not part of their daily life anymore. In this space, their mind begins to relax in a way it never could during the relationship. The silence, which once triggered panic, becomes something else entirely: room to breathe. For perhaps the first time in a long time, they notice how much energy they used to spend on holding a relationship together by themselves. And without that burden, they discover the relief of not having to fight so hard to be seen or valued. As this calm strengthens, the anxious partner begins to experience a new relationship with themselves. They recognize that the quiet is not dangerous, but healing, that solitude does not mean rejection, but recovery, and that distance does not equal abandonment, but freedom. These realizations take root slowly, but each day adds to the sense that peace is possible without having to cling to someone who cannot give the closeness they desire. Their body begins to respond too, with less tension in their chest, fewer restless nights, and a lighter emotional weight carried into their interactions with others. What once felt like a constant storm of overthinking begins to clear, and in that clarity, they realize that the anxious energy was not who they were, but a survival response to a relationship that kept them on edge. This change also brings a shift in identity, because for so long the anxious person may have defined themselves by their efforts in the relationship, being the one who loves harder, gives more, forgives quickly, and tries endlessly. When they leave, they no longer have to perform that role, and the absence of that pressure reveals parts of themselves they may have forgotten. They reconnect with hobbies, passions, friendships, and routines that had been overshadowed by the emotional labor of managing the connection. The more they focus on these, the more they feel grounded, and the less they are pulled back into the chaos of longing for someone who could not meet them halfway. This sense of rediscovery feeds the calm, because every step they take away from the old dynamic affirms that their worth was never tied to being chosen by someone who struggled to stay present. What makes this second change so profound is how different it feels from what the anxious partner expected. They may have feared that leaving would plunge them into despair, that the loss of the avoidant would magnify their fears of being alone, but instead the opposite occurs. The very thing they dreaded most, walking away, is what delivers the peace they had been searching for all along. That peace is not just a relief, it is a revelation, because it shows them that their emotional safety was never going to be found in chasing someone else's love, but in reclaiming their own power to step back and breathe. The calm that emerges becomes a foundation, not only for healing from the past relationship, but also for building a stronger sense of self moving forward. The third unexpected change that happens after the anxious leaves the avoidant is the sudden shift in balance within the dynamic, and it is one of the most striking transformations in the aftermath of separation. For so long, the anxious was positioned as the pursuer, the one who carried the weight of the relationship on their shoulders, constantly trying to fix, to reassure, to close the gap that the avoidant created. This imbalance made it seem as if the avoidant held all the control because they dictated the pace and the level of closeness, while the anxious was left scrambling to keep the bond alive. But when the anxious finally steps away, the balance turns on its head. The avoidant, who once felt in charge, is now left in silence with no one chasing, and the anxious, who always felt powerless, discovers what it means to hold the reins by simply withdrawing their energy. This shift can feel almost disorienting at first because the anxious is so accustomed to being in the weaker position that they might not immediately recognize how much power they have taken back. Instead of being consumed by waiting, hoping, and reaching, they realize that their absence speaks louder than all of their words ever could. The avoidant, who relied on the security of knowing that someone would always return, suddenly experiences what it feels like when that pattern breaks, and the absence of pursuit creates a tension they cannot ignore. Meanwhile, the anxious begins to understand that by doing nothing, by no longer pleading, texting, or proving, they have changed the entire emotional equation. The silence becomes their strength, and with it comes a new awareness that the power dynamic was never fixed, but always determined by where they placed their energy. As days pass, the avoidant may feel unsettled because the lack of pursuit reveals the extent of their dependence on the anxious partner's effort. Without that constant reassurance, their detachment feels less like control and more like isolation. This creates an inner conflict, where they start to question whether their need for space was ever truly satisfying, or if it was simply a way to avoid vulnerability while still reaping the comfort of someone else's devotion. For the anxious, this shift creates a quiet sense of validation because they finally see that their presence mattered more than they were led to believe. The realization that the avoidant notices their absence confirms what they doubted for so long, that their efforts were significant, and that stepping away has an impact. This change reframes how the anxious views the entire relationship dynamic, as they see themselves not as powerless, but as someone whose choices carry real weight. The longer this new balance holds, the more the anxious begins to feel the liberation of not being tethered to someone else's avoidance. They no longer live in reaction mode, constantly adjusting to the avoidant's distance, but instead they create the pace themselves. This allows them to step into a position of equality that was missing before, and with equality comes dignity. They may even notice subtle changes in how they carry themselves, in how they interact with others, and in how much more centered they feel, because the sense of desperation that once accompanied their love has been replaced with a steadier, more grounded presence. The avoidant, on the other hand, often struggles with this adjustment as they are forced to experience what it feels like to be on the receiving end of silence. That discomfort becomes a mirror, showing them what their partner endured for so long, and though they may not admit it, it often leaves them unsettled. This reversal of roles is not about punishment, but about clarity. It highlights that relationships are never sustained by one person alone, and that withdrawing energy can be just as powerful as giving it. For the anxious, the recognition of their own influence is life-changing because it shows them that they were never as helpless as they believed. For the avoidant, the silence exposes the fragility of the control they thought they had, and it plants the first seeds of doubt about the way they manage closeness. Together, these shifts create a new balance, one that redefines how each person sees the other and themselves, and the impact of this change sets the stage for every transformation that follows. When the anxious finally leaves, another unexpected change begins to take shape, and this time it is centered around reflection, a kind of deep self-examination that neither the anxious nor the avoidant could access while still entangled in the cycle. For the avoidant, the absence of pursuit creates quiet moments they cannot easily distract themselves from. And in that silence, their mind begins to revisit the choices they made, the ways they pushed away, and the countless opportunities for closeness they rejected. For the anxious, the space from constant chasing allows their perspective to widen, and they begin to reflect not only on the relationship itself, but also on the reasons they held on so tightly in the first place. Both sides are suddenly left with the time and clarity to confront the uncomfortable truths they avoided when the dynamic was still alive. And this reflection often leads to realizations that cut deeper than expected. For the avoidant, these reflections are often laced with regret because they begin to see how much effort was poured into them by someone who only wanted to be loved and secure. They remember the late-night texts they dismissed, the calls they ignored, and the conversations where they brushed off the emotional needs of their partner. What once seemed like a necessary retreat for self-preservation now looks, in hindsight, like missed chances for connection. They begin to feel the weight of how often they took reassurance without giving any back, and how much they relied on the patience and forgiveness of someone they eventually pushed too far. These realizations do not always lead to immediate change, but they stir an internal discomfort that challenges the very identity they built around independence and self-sufficiency. Reflection forces them to admit that their choices shaped the outcome, and that realization carries a sting that lingers. For the anxious, reflection takes a different path, one that leads them inward. Instead of focusing on the avoidant, they start to ask themselves why they tolerated being sidelined for so long, why they ignored the red flags, and why they believed that proving their love would ever be enough to make the relationship secure. They begin to see the patterns of over-functioning, of giving more than they received, of staying when their needs were consistently unmet. This reflection can be painful because it forces them to acknowledge the ways they betrayed their own boundaries and silenced their own voice in the pursuit of love. But within that pain lies a powerful insight, the recognition that their worth was never dependent on someone else's ability to show up, and that their longing for security was not a flaw, but a natural human need. This kind of self-examination, though difficult, becomes the soil for growth that could not have been planted while they were still stuck in the cycle. Over time, both partners may find themselves revisiting the same moments, but from opposite sides of the mirror. The avoidant remembers the times they withdrew, while the anxious recalls the times they pleaded, and in that parallel reflection, each sees a different truth about the same story. For the avoidant, it is a realization of what they lost through avoidance. For the anxious, it is a realization of what they lost by holding on too tightly. These mirrored perspectives create a depth of understanding that often surprises both of them, because it reveals that their behaviors were not isolated, but interconnected, feeding into each other and sustaining the very cycle that kept them trapped. Reflection makes visible what was invisible before, and that clarity has the power to reshape how each person views relationships moving forward. What makes this change so profound is that reflection cannot be forced while the dynamic is still alive, because the noise of chasing and retreating leaves no room for honest examination. It is only when the anxious steps away that both people are confronted with themselves, with their choices, and with the consequences of those choices. The avoidant must face the emptiness of the space they created, and the anxious must face the silence they once feared but finally embraced. In this space of reflection, uncomfortable truths rise to the surface, and though they may not resolve immediately, they linger in the mind and begin to alter the way each person sees not only the past, but also what they want in the future. The fifth unexpected change after the anxious leaves the avoidant is the growth that emerges out of the space created. Growth that neither side anticipates, but both are touched by in very different ways. For the anxious, stepping away means they are no longer trapped in the exhausting cycle of pursuit and disappointment, and that freedom becomes fertile ground for rediscovering themselves. The energy that was once poured into holding the relationship together now gets redirected into personal healing, passions, friendships, and new experiences that remind them of their value beyond the relationship. This expansion of self often surprises them because they never realized how much of their identity had been consumed by trying to bridge the emotional gap with the avoidant. With every step they take on their own, they build new layers of confidence and independence, realizing that their sensitivity and desire for connection are not weaknesses, but strengths that can be channeled in healthier ways. The avoidant, on the other hand, faces growth of a different kind, one that is born from discomfort rather than liberation. When the anxious departs, the avoidant is forced to sit with the silence that once felt protective but now feels isolating. And in that silence, seeds of awareness begin to sprout. They start to see how their patterns of withdrawal, once justified as self-preservation, have left them with less than they truly wanted. Their defenses may remain high, but beneath them they cannot escape the recognition that intimacy requires risk, and without risk, closeness cannot survive. This awareness often stirs an inner conflict, where they begin to question not just what they lost, but also who they have become through their avoidance. That questioning is the first step toward growth, because it forces them to consider whether the very strategies they relied on to stay safe are actually preventing them from experiencing the love and connection they secretly crave. For the anxious, growth is also about redefining love itself. They begin to understand that love is not meant to be earned through endless effort or secured by proving one's worth, but that real love comes from mutual investment, respect, and emotional availability. This realization often changes the way they view not only their past relationship, but also their future ones, because it helps them see that their needs are not excessive, but valid, and that they deserve a partner who can meet them with the same intensity they bring. This shift empowers them to set stronger boundaries, to recognize red flags earlier, and to value themselves enough to walk away from dynamics that drain them. The calm they discovered after leaving transforms into strength, and that strength becomes the foundation for a more balanced, fulfilling approach to connection in the future. For the avoidant, growth may come more slowly, but it is no less significant. The absence of the anxious partner highlights the comfort they once took for granted, and in that absence, they begin to feel a pull toward change. They may not immediately know how to lower their defenses or how to meet intimacy with openness, but the recognition that they want something different is a powerful beginning. This recognition often lingers in the back of their mind, influencing their behavior in subtle ways as they move forward. Whether or not they act on it right away, the experience leaves an imprint that challenges the way they see relationships, showing them that connection cannot be maintained without vulnerability. The memory of what they lost serves as both a reminder and a lesson, nudging them toward growth they may not have pursued otherwise. What makes this final change so impactful is that growth does not unfold in isolation, but in parallel, shaping both individuals in unique ways that ripple into their future. The anxious grows into a stronger, calmer, more self-assured version of themselves, discovering that their worth is not dependent on anyone else's validation. The avoidant grows through the quiet recognition of their own limitations, realizing that their strategies of retreat come at a cost, and that cost is often love itself. Both journeys may diverge, but each is altered permanently by the experience, because once growth has begun, it cannot be undone. The space created by the departure allows for clarity, strength, and transformation, and it is this shift that marks the most profound change of all.